One of the most common arguments between landlords and tenants is about landlords entering the property. How much notice can you give? Are the tenants allowed to refuse entry to the property? And under what circumstances can a landlord just enter the property? Now, a lot of self-managing landlords get this wrong, and that is so risky. More so now than ever before, with tenants' rights going through the roof, legislation going through the roof, all of the processes and procedures that landlords have to follow, all the laws and changes to laws and updated legislation that landlords have to know about. It's even more important now than ever that self-managing landlords follow the exact procedures precisely. A lot of self-managing landlords will believe that they can go round to a tenant's property and knock the door and say, "Can I come in? I want to do an inspection," or "I want to check the carpets," or "I want to check the condition of the property," whatever. Now, technically, if the tenant lets you in at that point, then okay, fair enough, you can go in. However, I would advise don't do that. If ever you and your tenant end up in court, for whatever reason, then your tenant could use that as some sort of harassment, interruption of the tenant's right to quiet enjoyment. I'll come back to that in a second. And that will go against you. Again, even more so now than ever. So don't just turn up at a tenant's property, knock the door and try and get in. Another big mistake that landlords make is that they turn up to a tenant's property, they knock the door, but the tenant's not in. So they use their own key to let themselves in. Another big mistake. That is an interruption of the tenant's right to quiet enjoyment. And that is a legal obligation for landlords. Provide your tenant with quiet enjoyment. It basically means that you're not allowed to interrupt their living. Simple as that. And it could also be deemed as harassment. It could be deemed as unlawful entry to the property. And you've got to remember, this is somebody's home. Now, I know it's your property, and a lot of landlords feel like that. This is my property. I should be able to access it whenever I want. Believe it or not, there are landlords that just go into a property, that just let themselves in, regardless of whether the tenant's in or not. That's really bad. And I don't mean it's really bad. You know, you might have a really good relationship with that tenant, but it's really bad from the legal perspective because it's illegal. Simple as that. Other landlords will give 24 hours notice to a tenant, good, but then deny the tenant's right to reject or decline that entry, which is bad. So this is the actual rule. If you want to enter that property, then first of all, you must give the tenant 24 hours notice. I think a lot of people know that already. Then the tenant has the right to refuse your entry to the property. It's as simple as that. However, if that 24 hours passes and the tenant has not refused entry to the property, then you may enter. Now, when you do that, I would advise you, and I would urge you actually, to still keep in your mind that you must provide the tenant with quiet enjoyment of that property. Leave them alone. If you give them 24 hours notice and they haven't responded, go to the property, still knock the door, and still respect their wishes to not let you enter that property. I know a lot of landlords are thinking, hang on a minute, but what if I need to get into that property? Okay, that's the next bit, isn't it? So follow the correct procedure to enter the property. Give 24 hours notice. Genuinely allow that tenant the right to refuse entry to the property. If they don't, enter the property and do whatever it is you were there to do. But if the tenant still doesn't want you to go into the property, this is where I now put my letting agency hat on. I've trained all of my lettings team to think very logically and very outside the box, let's just say that. Because I always believe that if you need to go to the property to inspect, or you need to go to the property to investigate a problem or something like that, and the tenant refuses access, I want to know why. And you as a landlord should also want to know why. So I always ask the tenant. When I was doing the day-to-day of my letting agency, I would always ask the tenant, what's the reason for that? And my team would ask the question, what's the reason for that? And it doesn't have to be a rude question. You don't need to be aggressive with it. You don't need to be forceful with it, but you do need to know why. Why is it, Mr. and Mrs. Tenant, that you're not allowing me entry to the property to carry out an inspection or to inspect some work a contractor has done, or whatever the reason is? Or maybe you even want to enter the property so that you can analyze if there's any improvements that you could make to the property. But if the tenant's not giving you access, why? So that's a really important question to ask. But I would urge you to do that and ask that question in a pleasant way, because let's not forget, it is that tenant's home. It might be your property, but it's the tenant's home. And in the same way, you have the right in your home to quiet enjoyment. People can't just come along and let themselves in no matter what. It should be the same in a tenant's home. And I agree with that. I definitely agree with that. But at the same time, you have a duty as the owner of that property, and my lettings team have a duty as the managing agent for that property on behalf of the owner of that property. We have a duty to ensure that the property is being looked after, that the property is safe and secure, that the tenant is looking after the property correctly. But we also need to make sure there are no things like damp or condensation. There's no risks or hazards. We're trying to comply with the HHSRS, which is very serious, by the way, really serious. In fact, go over to my YouTube channel and check out HHSRS. You can find it on my channel. So search Tom Soane, HHSRS. Very, very serious. But a lot of landlords don't know about it, and a lot of landlords do know about it and don't think it's very serious. It's crazy serious. Anyway, I've gone off on a tangent there. Shock. So ask the tenant the question, why will you not allow me access to the property? Because this is why I want to access the property. Now, there's a little addition to all of this, which everybody should know. If there's an emergency, again, bit of a grey area here, but if there is an emergency, a genuine emergency, then you must enter that property to fix that emergency issue straight away. You must. And there's a number of reasons for that. There could be emergencies that put the tenant at risk. There could be emergencies that put the property at risk. There could be emergencies that put the neighbours' properties at risk. Whatever it is, you have to be able to access that property. Now, that's not necessarily you, Mr. and Mrs. Landlord, but a contractor or the appropriate person needs to be able to access the properties. And here's another little tip for self-managing landlords. Put something in the window of the property. It doesn't need to be anything massive, just something in the window of the property that says, in case of an emergency, call this number. Because then, if ever the authorities need to get into the property, if the fire service need to get into the property, rather than them smashing down your door, they might be able to contact you or the letting agent to give them access to the property. That's a really smart way of protecting your property and ensuring that your tenant is safe, the property is good. Look, let's face it, accessing a property most of the time needed by landlords and letting agencies, because we do have to make sure that your asset, Mr. and Mrs. Landlord, is being looked after and it's safe and it's secure and it's hazard free and it complies with legislation. We've got to do that. And if tenants ever listen to this, I don't know why tenants would listen to this, but some tenants perhaps might be interested to know this side of the fence. But if tenants ever listen to this, then allow the landlord or the letting agent reasonable access to the property, because it might benefit you. It helps the letting agent make sure that your property is in good condition, and they can identify any work that's needed. They can identify any improvements that the landlords can make. They can identify that you're safe as a tenant, that the property is compliant with legislation. They're not there to judge how you live. And this is, I think, a big factor for tenants refusing access. There are people in the world that aren't clean and tidy 100% of the time. There are people in the world that leave their washing on the bedroom floor. There are people in the world that might leave the washing up for a day. But there are also landlords out there that almost demand that their tenants live cleanly and tidily. And unfortunately, everybody's different. Not everybody folds all their washing up every single day. Not everybody keeps the kitchen 100% spotless every single day. Not everybody hoovers every day, polishes every day. Not everybody does that. So try to remember, if you inspect a property, you visit a property and the tenant's allowed access to it, great. Be thankful for that, because I promise you this, there are some tenants out there that just refuse access. That's it. So be thankful, first of all, that your tenant has allowed access to the property. But don't judge the way they live. Don't interrogate them. Remember, it's their home. That's the most important thing. And if landlords live by that rule and remember that the tenants have a right for that place to be their home. It's your property, Mr. and Mrs. Landlord. You own it, but it's their home. And just imagine if it was the other way around. Imagine if your mortgage lender just sent somebody round to your house every 6 months to inspect the property. And that mortgage lender was then telling you that you should clean this, you should tidy this. You'd tell them to F off, wouldn't you? You wouldn't allow it. You wouldn't allow access to it. So remember that. That's the equivalent. You effectively are the mortgage lender. If you are a self-managing landlord, I don't know why anybody would be a self-managing landlord in this lettings environment. You know, unless you are set up like a letting agent, where you are constantly keeping yourself updated with legislation, not just new legislation, but updates to existing legislation. Like, for an example, the government's How to Rent guide has been updated. All of those things you need to keep on top of. All of the procedures, all of the documents, all the templates. You must follow the correct process for absolutely everything you do, because if you ever end up in court, then it's going to be a problem if you haven't. And a lot of landlords think, well, I've got a good relationship with my tenant, it will never end up in court. Well, I can assure you that very quickly it will end up in court if that tenant stops paying rent. And they might not stop paying rent viciously or spitefully. They might stop paying rent because they lose their job. They might stop paying rent because their circumstances change. They might stop paying rent because they get into a debt and they can't afford everything. They might just be a bit crap with money and they might not be able to afford their rent. And that very quickly will end up in court. And if you've harassed that tenant, and bear in mind, it might not be your interpretation of harassment, it might be the tenant's interpretation of harassment. And I promise you the judge will listen to that. So if you have been deemed to harass the tenant, not allow 100% peaceful, quiet enjoyment of that property, then it will be very difficult for you to get your rent back. It will be very difficult for you to evict the tenant. It will be very difficult for you to take any action of any kind. So remember that. I'm not just saying all these things because, oh, it's legislation, you must follow legislation. No, I'm saying all these things so that if you're self-managing, and again, I don't know why anybody would self-manage at the moment, but if you are self-managing, then I want you to get it right. I don't want landlords to end up in court or end up in difficulty because they haven't followed the right procedures. Being a landlord's tough enough as it is. The next thing I want to say very quickly is that if you are a self-managing landlord and you're finding it very easy, you never have any issues, then I can assure you, you are missing things. Guarantee it. If you're finding it easy, you feel like I'm never having to do anything. No, my tenants are good as gold. They never call me. They just get on with their lives. It's no problem. They pay their rent every month. I guarantee you're missing something. And I don't mean to catch you out. I'm not looking for a witch hunt here, but it's definitely worth checking to make sure you are 100% compliant. And I tell you what, my company use a very detailed audit. It's a compliance audit. Now, either you can have my team do that audit for you, or I can send you the audit and you can do it yourself. I just want to make sure everybody gets it right. I won't charge for it. I just want to make sure that landlords are protected. Now, of course, my message by doing that is, if you're going to self-manage, get it right. If you're not going to self-manage, use my letting agency. Absolutely. Or use another letting agency. But I'd prefer it if you used my letting agency. Of course I would. But use a letting agent. If you want to use my letting agent or you want to talk to my letting agent, then just contact me. It's tom@soanegroup.co.uk. And if you do want to use my letting agent, I will set you up first of all with an onboarding call, or we can just do a fact find just to work out what's the best way for you. Because it might be that a letting agent just isn't right for you. But if it's not right for you, then I want to make sure that you've got the right resources. For an example, my letting agency provide what we call a landlord support service, which is, it's only a few quid a month, but then you have access to all of the correct documents, procedures, templates, even emails, but you also have access to my team. So you can ask questions at any time, you can give us a ring and you can find out what's the best way to handle certain situations and deal with things. That's the landlord support package. So give 24 hours notice to your tenant. Allow them the right to refuse your entry, and don't just turn up or let yourself in. Good luck, everyone.